Well, welcome, Michael and John. Um, and the focus of our time together is the time after Easter. Um, so, Michael, take it
Yes.
away.
And I made two choices in picking this topic. The first one was it's the part of the catechumenal process that I think a large number of people don't appreciate. And the second is that there are two movements within this phase, and I wanted to focus primarily on the first because the phase both looks to the past and looks to the future. And this one was entitled something about, reflecting upon what happened. So I wanted to look at the first part of the process. Uh, and it's an interesting bit of history that this is in the ancient church, and especially the Western church, was an integral part of the catechumenal process.
Mm.
Uh, for instance, in 5th century Milan, every single day, the newly baptized and initiated were expected to show up for Eucharist wearing their white robes.
Wow.
And Ambrose preached two series of sermons during Easter week to the newly baptized. And that's how we know a great deal about what the rites of initiation were
Right.
in 5th century Po Valley, because he talked about them in detail, step by step, twice. Uh, the same thing was happening in Rome. Again, it was a week of going to Eucharist in your white robe. And in Rome, we also know from the lectionaries that other things kind of continued. It's not clear because, of course, lectionaries and sacramentaries don't exactly explain things. They just give you, here's a text. But there's even in the oldest Roman sacramentaries, um, it's called the Pascha Annotina, the year later Pascha, Easter,
Mm.
where on the anniversary, their birthday, um, there was a final celebration for them.
Mm.
So it's very clear that in the ancient world, the idea of continuing to accompany new Christians was a big deal. It's very clear that two bishops who, Milan and Rome, who had lots of things to do, devoted still an entire week to preaching to these people. And in thinking about why that would be so important, all I could do was think about part of my own career as a teacher, because I spent about 15 years being officially certified by the state of Ohio with the title of Mentor in the Craft of Teaching.
Mm. Wow.
I was not the cooperating teacher for the new teacher. Their department gave them a cooperating teacher who helped them get through the departmental curriculum, gave a lot of real hands-on suggestions
Mm.
about pedagogy, how to do this. My job was to get them to discuss bigger questions. For instance, discipline.
Mm.
Uh, what works, what doesn't work. And again, so much of my job was conversations about actual incidents that had happened.
Mm.
And it was in reflecting upon what had happened and what had worked and what hadn't when they were trying it. Uh, I also along the way would be a cooperating teacher. Ohio has not only student teaching, but it also has the year or so before student observation, where you spend like 8 weeks at one school working with a teacher or two. And I would get some of these. And the next summer, I ran into this one young woman who had purposefully uh, picked St. X as a place she wanted to observe at because she'd gone to a girls' school
Hmm.
and she wanted to find out how boys worked. So, but I ran into her and she said, "Thank you." I thought, well, that's nice to hear.
Mm.
She said, "I wouldn't have known how to handle a co-ed classroom if
Mm.
I hadn't had that experience." And
Mm.
she said it was like day two, and there were these three guys in the far right corner in the back who were kind of not exactly paying attention. So she said, I just casually strolled down the aisle and said, "Hi, guys. Um, you know my name, but I'm still learning yours. But you seem to be confused about something. You need help of some kind? I'm glad to help you." "Oh, no, no, we're just getting settled here, et cetera." And she said, "Okay, well, just ask." And then she said, I strolled back up to the front. And for the rest of the time she was there, um, everything was completely calm because she took my advice. Don't confront, casually start a conversation
Mm.
Mhm. uh, and ask their opinion. And that's the kind of reflective learning that
Mhm.
really empowers people.
Mm.
Uh, all right, now we'll see if Natalie shows up. Uh, but as I said, that's why I wanted in this, presentation to focus upon the reflective part
Mm.
because 50 days is a long time.
Mm.
But it starts with the fact that people who have been preparing for to do something at Easter, those getting baptized are clearly going to do more than those making affirmation.
Mhm.
But they're both going to be publicly named. They're going to be put in a position where they're highly visible. They will say things in public. Um, Ritual gestures will be something that they're included in, and like hands imposed upon them, etc. Um, and we're not just heads on a stick. We're human beings with bodies and minds and souls, and all of those work together. Um, I think the first thing presupposition that the people who are going to lead people through the great neophytes through the great 50 days.
What the heck
Uh,
is this?
yes, John. Uh, okay. Who are going to lead people through the great 50 days need to realize is that, um, first off, immediate preparation should make a difference.
Well, the other thing, Michael, is it gets away from Easter being graduation, you know?
Exactly.
It's this living out what
Right.
baptism is about.
And um, just as when you get married, something in your life ends and another phase begins, and it's not like what it was before.
Mm.
So exactly the same thing happens at Easter. Um, so it's that mindset that the people who are going to lead this need to begin with, that we have to get them in touch, not with ideas, though ideas are part of it. We have to get them in touch with their experiences. And experiences for human beings are mind and heart. And that combination will lead to action. So, um, experiential learning. They just did things at Easter. And so the biggest suggestion, and in Journey to Baptismal Living's website, if you're looking under worship resources at the ecumenical rites, there's a long description, and John helped participate in writing them, for how to do mystagogy, because nobody had any detailed suggestions. And the very first one for the very first session is a highly experiential suggestion, which is take them to where things happened. Take them to the font, have them at least dip their hands in it and throw some water around. Uh, and it's helpful if the person leading this also has the texts. Now, you wouldn't want to read the blessing over the waters to them, but there are some of the other shorter ritual texts which could verbally prompt their memory of what that moment uh, in the service had meant to them. Uh, and um, it was very interesting. I was doing some research on this about 10 years ago, and we've only had 2 Jews go through our catechumenal process. And this was an older man. Um, and he said to me afterwards, whenever I mentioned the Holy Spirit, you said, just wait. Because, of course, his tradition really had no explicit thing called the Holy Spirit. Uh, I said, just wait. And he said, when I was kneeling in the font with my face like 2 inches above the water, and all this water was pouring over me, and I couldn't see anything, and I had to have my eyes closed, but I was in the water all the way. And he said, and all I could feel was the movements in my soul.
Mm.
Oh, lovely.
And he said, oh, that's what they're talking about. That's the spirit. Because he said, I could feel myself being changed within. Uh, so it's giving them the chance through very, the tactile, the auditory, et cetera, the visual, to recapture that moment, because that gives them now time to take the feelings that were part of that moment, realize that they had them, uh, and so to speak, I don't want to say confront them again, perhaps better would be to encounter them again. And um, and it's important too for the sponsors to be able to be part of this, because they've been walking with these people, they know these people, and now they're walking with them through these rituals. And you get interesting comments which tend to fit into two categories. One is, this is what I experienced while you were doing that.
Mhm.
Um, and the other is, I could tell this was happening in you by the look on your face. Uh, so the sponsors have an important experiential role to play in this as well,
Mhm.
because they can enrich the
Mhm.
recalling of the experience.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Um, and uh, and we used to call it the conversation around the pool, but that's only the first part, because then there are the places where they were had hands laid on them. There were, for us, the places where they were anointed with the chrism, the white robe, the candle, those kinds of things. Uh, and um, uh, that recalling it, you should also not be surprised. In fact, you should also expect that somebody's going to start crying. That is a not uncommon experience in this. Um, and that's when you discover that, yes, in our sacraments, the Spirit really is at work. And and the two great New Testament images, people are really dying and rising, and people are being reborn.
Mhm.
Uh, and to have a chance to talk about that with the people whom they have walked with for months through this process enriches everybody's experience,
Mhm.
just as the sharing of our experiences with the people whom we love and who love us is a major part of growing in love. uh, which is actually the origin of the Greek name for this one. Myste is related to mystery, which in modern English means a problem to be solved. And that's not what it means in the ancient languages. A mystery is precisely um, an event larger than we are that we can only begin to understand by encountering it. For instance, there's the mystery of suffering. And you will not understand what suffering can mean for a human being until you have suffered. Or, like the one we all face, the mystery of death. We have indications of what's next, but we're called to embrace something that we're not going to understand until we do it.
Mhm.
Uh, and so the experience at the font and the other ritual moments, it's only those who've been through it who can actually tell us what really happened to them. And of course, that's the missed part, which also in ecclesiastical Greek, the word for what we call sacraments is the mysteries. Uh, and agoge is from the Greek word to lead. So the name that was given to it in Greek is literally leading people through the sacraments, not as a head trip, but by getting them in touch with their experiences. And since there were very few indications of what the rest of mystagogy should look like, either from the ancient world or from the modern suggestions among the denominations. What we did when we were working on this was say, well, just as the Lenten lectionary in Cycle A is the old Roman lectionary for catechumens. And if you wanted to know how they were preparing people for baptism, look at the Sunday readings in Cycle A, and it'll tell you what they thought was the way to do it. And especially the third, fourth, and fifth Sundays, each of which has a story of encounter between Jesus and people in some ways, a crisis situation. The Samaritan woman at the well, her life is screwed up. The man born blind, it not only deals with that, but his religious establishment is asking, who sinned? Which also puts him in a profoundly unpleasant place. And then you get the two sisters of Lazarus who believe in Jesus, but who are challenged to go even more deeply into the quite literal mystery. So just as the lectionary so how do you get people ready for baptism? You try to get them to encounter Jesus and ask them, how is he calling you to stop being blind to all kinds of things? How is he already giving you living water within? Can you really, when you step into the font, think you are going to die and rise? And it's that personal relationship that each of those passages calls those preparing for baptism to, that is the basis for whatever is going to happen in that font. And then the logical thing afterwards is to trust the lectionary, because it again reflects how the early church thought you would take people who had just had this experience of rebirth and try to, I love the phrase, unpack it for them.
So what you're suggesting, Michael, is during just assuming that every gathering of the catechumenal community has been doing Lectio, that
Yes,
between Easter and Pentecost.
yes. And in the first 3 weeks after Easter, the first is always doubting Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
And the assurance that, yeah, they could see, but those who haven't seen but still believe are even more blessed. Now, when you stop and think, that's a really major thing to say. You're luckier than the apostles, is what that statement says.
Mm.
And go for it, folks. And if the reflecting upon what they experienced there from that perspective, from a concrete, in the first mystagogical section, first reflective session, that's when they walk through it, where it comes alive in their memory first, and then in their imagination, and then in their mind and heart.
Now, one of the things that I've been familiar with in terms of the time between Easter and Pentecost is um, having the catechumenal community be involved in service.
Right. Well,
Uh,
that's coming. That's
okay.
coming. Because the second Sunday after Easter, the third of Easter, is always some encounter with the risen Lord in the context of a meal. And it's one of the unfortunate things, I think, about Western theology is that we have so often connected the Eucharist with Calvary, but we have too often missed the connection to the fact that the risen Lord likes to have meals with his friends.
Yeah.
Um, and that Emmaus is just as important as the Last Supper in understanding what we
Yeah.
do when we do Eucharist. Uh, and that the way the risen Lord is primarily present among his people is precisely when they share this meal with him. Because if you're leading them into the mysteries, into the sacraments, that makes sense that the next session should be, in some sense, an exploration of the real presence of the risen Lord in the Eucharist. Um, and there, as a Roman Catholic, I'm blessed with the fact that Vatican II taught that there were four real presences.
Mhm.
And the congregation gathered as the living body, and those who minister and enact the role of headship within that assembly, in the word that's proclaimed, and in the bread and cup blessed and shared together. And that all four of those are Jesus's real present. And in fact, they're probably even progressive. If you can't look around and feel the unity, and if the ministers don't call you together, and if you don't hear the word together, then what are you doing when you walk up?
And John, wouldn't you say that that also echoes current Anglican theology of Eucharist?
Yes. Yes, indeed. In fact, I think in beginning to move away from the, the preoccupation with the technology of consecration,
Yes.
and recovering a semblance of an actual meal shared and restoring broken bread instead of individualized bread. Yes, we are celebrating something more than just Jesus' last words.
Mhm.
We're celebrating him and us as one body.
Mhm.
But that's we're not there yet all the way for by any means.
Yeah.
No.
And in my experience, one of the challenges in mystagogy is that all of these rich dimensions were not experienced. They were watched
Hmm.
as spectators,
Yeah.
um, because the clergy were behaving as performers.
Mhm.
And that's a huge corner to turn.
Yeah, it is.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, we could spend a lot of time on that one.
Yes,
Yeah.
but the interest, therefore, the suggestion that the group that dealt with mystagogy made was um, this would be the place where the experience of serving should begin. If they're competent, because you don't want to stick people into situations where they're uncomfortable, etc. But if they're competent, then on the third Sunday of Easter, they could be the readers. And they could also help with communion. Or if nothing else, they could help take up the collection. That doesn't require any verbalization. Um, but that stepping into a role in the community in which they serve the worship of the community um, is actually of a reflection upon their baptism.
Mm.
It's asking them to take what their baptism meant in this area and do something.
Mm.
Now, maybe they'll volunteer to join the readers list, maybe they won't, et cetera, et cetera. But at least we thought they should be challenged to exercise a public liturgical ministry.
Mm.
Because especially if they're coming out of an evangelical background, the only ministries they know are preaching and music.
Mm.
And the whole idea that scripture could be proclaimed by an ordinary parishioner is something they have not encountered.
Mm.
So again, the second session we suggested was based upon reflecting upon, because they not only show at Easter Vigil, they shared not only in baptism, they shared in the table.
Mm.
And so leading them through all the sacraments that they experienced that night.
Yeah.
Um, and then it's also one of the delightful things in the new, what's still to me the new lectionary, is that the fourth Sunday of Easter is always the Good Shepherd, which is again a meditation upon the meaning of the risen Lord. What does it mean to say that Christ is risen? What it ultimately means is Jesus is the accompanying me through my life and ultimately through my death. And so many of the Good Shepherd passages include that statement, which links it to the previous Sunday. The Good Shepherd feeds his flock. So that if you look at those second, third, and fourth Sundays of Easter, they're all ultimately reflections both on the meaning of Jesus's resurrection, but also on the ways in which we encounter the risen Lord and what he means to us through those encounters. They're all three, even the Good Shepherd one, really makes most sense if you realize that they're looking back still. They're looking towards what does the resurrection of Jesus mean for us and for me? And if you start with the scriptures, do Lectio Divina, but use that perspective in the explication of the text and in the discussions, uh, then you're really doing that kind of reflective learning. And by the time they get done reflecting on the Good Shepherd, you will have taken people who experienced something at Easter Vigil and hopefully help them to situate that within an understanding of their own life as a Christian and the life of the community. Is that making sense? Or you got any questions?
It makes sense, Michael. I guess I'm just thinking of, I know in some catechumenates that I've been part of, this is also a place where there's an effort, and sometimes you do it together as a catechumenal community, for example, of helping in a food program, and
Right.
then after doing it, reflecting back what was that, or
Yes.
becoming aware of different ministries of a congregation. Um, and so that folks start to see some ways of living out their baptism
Yeah.
or of their being received into a different denominations, that they've kind of start to see, oh, these are actually ways of serving that I can be involved in.
Well, and that's what the lectionary does. Leaving aside Ascension, which some places do on the seventh Sunday of Easter and others don't, what you got on the fifth, sixth, and seventh Sundays of Easter is Gospels from the Last Supper discourse. And Jesus is telling them precisely, the Spirit's going to come and you're going to have to go out and do things. And by the way, you're not my servants, you're my friends.
Mm.
Um, and so you've got 3 Sundays there of quite literally mission material, which segues perfectly off the previous 3 Sundays and is leading up to Pentecost when the Spirit comes with wind and flame and a wham bang and tells them, go to the ends of the earth.
Mm.
Um, so that, yeah, that kind of service component would be essential in this.
Mm.
But, and what's cool is, I'll lapse into teen speak. What's cool about this is the readings, those 3 Sundays readings support that.
Mm.
And if you're wondering what it meant, if you're trying to reflect upon that experience, they give you a scriptural context to reflect upon it.
Mhm.
Go and bear fruit,
Mm.
because the uh, fifth and sixth Sundays in A are from chapter 14, and B are from 15, and from C are from 16. So across a 3-year cycle, you're getting 3 different consecutive chapters of the Last Supper discourse. And the seventh Sunday, if you use those readings, is always from the 17th chapter.
Mm. Just noticing our time, uh, how do you bring a community sort of to some form of closure around Pentecost?
Um, the evangelical Lutherans are the ones who created the rite of the affirmation of vocation
Mm.
at Pentecost. And
Mhm.
it's clear from listening to Episcopalians talk that a lot of them have stolen the rite.
Yeah.
Mm.
Um, and if in the first part of it, if the first 4 Sundays of Easter time are truly reflective, that gives you the basis for doing what I didn't want to go into at length tonight, which was the last 4 Sundays. But the whole 8 Sunday process would be leading up to the affirmation of vocation. And you could, at that point, be able to say how the Spirit was calling you concretely. Because that, again, the same guy I mentioned before who talked about with his, in the water and the Spirit was moving in his soul. And then we clothed them in a white robe, gave them a candle, and they were all standing up front. And while we were praying, before we did the prayer for the sevenfold Spirit, we all spent about 3 minutes singing the Taizé refrain, Veni Sancte Spiritus.
Mm.
And he said, this time I was looking out at you all. And what I felt happening in my soul was this weaving.
Mm.
Your souls and my soul
Mhm.
are being woven together. And he
Mhm.
said, and I knew that was the Spirit also.
Mm.
So, yeah, the rights there. I didn't want to try to talk about, more specifics for the second part this time, because talking about specifics for the first is people have to explore that thought. Experiential learning does not come easily to many people who are called upon to lead it.
Mm.
They're used to thinking you're giving a lecture,
Mm.
not exploring experiences together.
Mhm.
Which is really, in terms of all of the different theories of adult education and formation,
Yep.
that's what they're affirming is with adults, you've got people who have some experiences, and hopefully we've nurtured the development of reflecting on those
Yes.
versus thinking that there's some golden content that we're responsible of pouring into them. It's more like there's something in their experience that is gold, and what we're having them do is to reflect on them, and the gold will surface.
Yes. And sometimes you discover that in some ways their spirit is bigger than yours.
Oh, yeah.
It can be a humbling experience.
Mhm.
A couple of times in University of Cincinnati's College for Old Folks Continuing Ed, uh, I've offered an 8-week course on Plato's Meaning of Love. And we've read either the Symposium or the Phaedrus. And I've taught both of those to high school seniors and college undergraduates. But reading them with grandparents, I just kind of sit back and I direct them a bit, but they've got things to say. And as they get to know each other, they become more self-revelatory. Talking to people in their 70s about the meaning of love,
Mm.
expect to be humbled at times. The one guy, he and his wife, he was a public school teacher, but they had fostered 30 children.
Mm.
Wow.
Yeah.
Not necessarily for a very long time, but even the
Mhm.
shorter ones have a different challenge to them. So, experiential learning, let them, and our
Mhm.
job, who is it? Is it Augustine who says that people who do catechumenal work are midwives?
Mm. Yeah. I think that's a great image.
Yes,
It's also used for an image of spiritual direction, which goes on in the catechumenal process
yes,
in
yes,
different ways. But I think maybe that's not such a bad way of ending our time, that image of midwifery. And I think um, I was watching Call the Midwife, the BBC series,
Mhm.
and I'm always struck with, I mean, they try to be, I've been present to enough births, they try to be pretty realistic about it's pretty messy and cutting of the cord and all that. But I'm always amazed how a really key moment is the baby is kind of cleaned up and then wrapped in something warm and then given back to the mother, um, and just put on her tummy is really what they do.
Yes,
And I've
where
often,
it's dwelt for a long time.
yeah, um, what a great image of mystagogy, of handing back um, the treasure that's been birthed. Uh,
Yes.
so
And my friend Peggy, I asked her once, you know, 5 kids? And she said, when you've just been in labor for hours and you're saying, why am I doing this again? And then they do exactly what you described, and you look at it and you say, oh, yeah,
mm,
yeah.
yeah,
What I like is you can see on YouTube pictures of fathers of newborns.
yeah, yeah,
Uh, and again, from retreat work I did with seniors, and the number of fathers who in their letter would say, you were our firstborn, and I knew I had to change some things in my life when
mm,
I held you in my arms for the first time.
yeah, good,
Sacramental moments,
yes,
mystery.
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
yeah,
But these is we're still talking about mystagogy here.
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yes, we're
sure,
talking about the moment of rebirth and how do you help people appreciate, encounter, and
mhm,
claim
yeah,
what happened to them at that moment.
savor,
Yes,
savor those moments, which is again another principle in spiritual direction of helping people to savor experiences
yes,
and not necessarily rush on, but kind of in a sense marinate in those experiences.
yes.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
it's
just
been
watch,
nice having this conversation.
yeah, just watching our time and the fact that we'll transfer this over to YouTube. I let's see what I'm gonna do is